The lonely cowboy rode in town alone for supplies, but found a hungry bride begging for bread. In the winter of 1877, the snow lay heavy across the Wyoming plains, the kind that swallowed sound and left even the boldest riders feeling like ghosts drifting through the white. John Calhoun, a cowboy who hadn't spoken 10 full words to another soul in weeks, rode into the town of Willow Creek with his horse breathing steam and his saddle stiff with frost. He came for salt, flour, and cartridges, nothing more. He lived by the rule of taking what was needed and leaving no trace of himself behind. But the town was quieter than he remembered. Smoke rose thin from chimneys, and doors stayed shut against the cold. As he dismounted by the general store, he noticed her, hunched against the wooden porch, her dress worn thin, her hands blue with cold. She couldn't have been more than 20. She lifted her face when she heard his boots crunch the snow, and he saw eyes wide with both hunger and shame. "Bread," she whispered. "Just a piece, for my baby." John froze. He had seen beggars before, but not like this. Her wedding band, dull with scratches, still clung to her finger. She wasn't some drifter. She belonged to someone once, someone who should have been there. Her arms curled protectively around a bundle of rags, from which came a faint, desperate cry. He shifted, torn. His own supplies were meager, barely enough to carry him through the next drive, but something in her voice cut through the hard shell he had built around himself. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a chunk of stale cornbread, holding it out without a word. Her eyes filled when she took it, breaking it into tiny bits to press against the baby's lips. John watched the infant's mouth tremble and then latch onto the crumbs as though life itself was returning. The sight stirred something in him he hadn't felt since Texas, when a fever had taken his brother's children before his very eyes. The woman looked up, shame giving way to gratitude. "My husband," her voice faltered. "He left after the snows came. Said he'd bring back work or food. That was 3 weeks ago." John's jaw tightened. He knew what 3 weeks meant in this country. Men froze in less than one. Yet he said nothing, because what words could soften truth that sharp? The wind howled around them, and John realized the general store's windows were dark. A notice nailed to the door read, "Closed, supplies gone." The town itself was starving. He glanced back at her and the baby, then at his horse. He had planned to buy, ride out, and disappear again into silence. But the plan no longer fit. He thought of the flour sack he carried, and how a portion of it might stretch further with careful hands. He thought of his cartridges, and how meat might still be taken from the frozen woods. More than that, he thought of the hollowness he carried inside, and how the sight of this woman and her child seemed to press against that emptiness like a hand on an open wound. For the first time in months, maybe years, John Calhoun spoke more than a whisper. "I'll help you." The words hung between them, fragile as the snowflakes drifting down, yet heavier than any promise he had ever made. And as her eyes met his, he knew that what had begun as a lonely ride for supplies had turned into something else entirely, something that might bind his fate to hers in a way neither of them could yet reckon. In the biting cold, silence pressed down like a weight as John stood there, his breath fogging in the air between him and the woman. She shifted, rocking the bundle in her arms, her eyes flickering between fear and a fragile kind of hope. He had offered words, and words meant something out here. Promises could not be taken back. They were heavier than bullets. The baby whimpered, and the sound gnawed at him. It reminded him of long nights on the trail when the coyotes cried out, searching for scraps of life in a land that gave so little. Only this sound was sharper, cutting deep. He turned and looked down the main street of Willow Creek, a town half dead beneath the snow. A few lanterns glowed behind curtains, but no one came outside. Folks were shuttered in, hoping to ride out the winter, rationing what they had left. He knew he could not leave her there. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low. She hesitated, as if afraid even of that. "Clara," she said finally. "Clara Mayfield." "And the baby?" Her lips trembled. "Eli." John nodded once, then looked toward the horse. "Come on," he said. Clara blinked, clutching the child closer. "Where?" "My camp's not far. Better than freezing here." She looked down at her shoes, soaked and thin, snow melting through to her skin. He didn't wait for her answer, just moved to the horse and shifted his gear. When she still didn't move, he glanced back, and something in his stare, unyielding, steady, seemed to break through her fear. Slowly, she rose, cradling Eli, and stepped toward him. John lifted her onto the horse as though she weighed nothing, then swung up behind them. The warmth of her body pressed against him, fragile as glass. With a click of his tongue, he turned the horse back into the white wilderness. They rode in silence. The snow muffled everything, only the creak of leather and the faint cry of Eli cutting through. Clara shivered against him, but he said nothing, keeping the horse steady across the frozen ground. After a mile or two, he steered them into a thicket where a small camp waited, a canvas tent half buried in snow, a stack of chopped wood, and a fire pit now cold. He dismounted and lifted her down, then went about building the fire with practiced movements. Sparks caught, flames licked upward, and soon warmth began to spread in the circle of light. Clara crouched close, holding Eli near the heat, tears glinting in her eyes as the baby stirred more strongly. From his supplies, John pulled a strip of dried venison and a pouch of beans. He set them in a pot with snow to melt and placed it over the fire. Clara watched him, wary at first, then softer, as though she could not quite believe kindness was real anymore. When the food was ready, he handed her a tin plate. She ate in small, trembling bites, every movement careful, as though afraid it might vanish before she finished. Eli was too small for anything but crumbs softened with broth, but even that seemed to ease the child's cries. Afterward, Clara leaned back against a log, eyes heavy, Eli asleep in her arms. She looked toward John, her voice breaking the quiet. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." He didn't answer right away. The fire crackled, and he stared into it, seeing shadows move like ghosts. "Maybe I do," he said finally. "Maybe I know more than you think." Her brow furrowed, but exhaustion weighed her down, and soon her eyes closed. John sat there long after, listening to the steady breathing of mother and child, the fire snapping softly. The snow fell outside the circle of light, endless and heavy, but inside there was something he hadn't felt in years. Company. A reason to keep the fire burning. The days that followed stretched into a rhythm. John hunted in the mornings, his rifle slung across his back, leaving Clara and Eli by the fire with wood and water. He returned with rabbits, sometimes a deer, his hands quick to skin and clean, his eyes scanning the trees for danger. Clara cooked what she could, stretching each meal to last, her hands steady though her frame was thin. At night, they spoke little, but when they did, the words mattered. She told him about her husband, Samuel, a farmer who had believed the land would give if he just worked hard enough. But the blizzard had come early that year, killing the crops, starving the livestock. Samuel had left to find work in the mines across the mountains. He had promised he'd return. He hadn't. John listened without judgment. He told her little of himself, only that he had worked cattle drives down from Texas, that he had buried too many men and seen too many winters. He left out the details, the family he had once had, the fire that had taken more than land could repay, the loneliness that had driven him north. Some wounds were not meant for words, but Clara seemed to sense the shadows in him, and though she didn't ask, her silence spoke of understanding. One evening, as the wind roared outside and snow piled high against the tent, Eli began to cough, a harsh, rattling sound that made Clara's eyes fill with panic. She rocked him, whispering his name, but the cough grew worse, his tiny chest struggling. John moved quickly, throwing more wood on the fire, heating water, cutting strips of cloth for steam. "Hold him close," he said, his voice firm. "Let him breathe it in." Clara obeyed, pressing Eli near the steam, tears streaking her cheeks. John watched, his stomach tight, every breath of the child echoing in his chest. Hours dragged by, the storm outside howling like wolves, but finally Eli's cough eased, his breaths growing softer. Clara sagged with relief, clutching him close, whispering thanks over and over. John sat back, exhaustion pulling at him, but inside something shifted. The sight of her holding her child, fighting for him with every ounce of her strength, struck him harder than any bullet ever had. He realized then he was no longer helping out of pity or obligation. He was bound to them now, in a way he couldn't explain. The weeks wore on. Together, they braved the winter, their lives stitched tighter each day. Clara began to laugh sometimes, soft and fleeting, but real, the sound startling John like sunlight breaking through cloud. Eli grew stronger, his eyes brighter, his grip firmer when he clutched John's finger. Yet with every day that passed, a shadow lingered, the possibility of Samuel returning. Clara never stopped glancing toward the horizon, never stopped hoping. And John, though he said nothing, felt the weight of that hope pressing down on him. One afternoon, while they gathered wood near the edge of the forest, Clara spoke quietly, her breath visible in the cold. "If he comes back," she trailed off, staring at her hands. John looked at her, his face unreadable. "If he comes back, he'll find you alive. That's what matters." She nodded, but her eyes didn't meet his. The silence stretched between them, heavy with words unspoken. The winter began to break slowly, the snow melting in patches, the ground softening beneath. Birds returned, their cries sharp in the thinning air. With spring came both promise and fear. Food grew easier to find, but so did travel. If Samuel was alive, if he was searching, now was the time he might return. One morning, as dawn spilled pale light over the camp, John saddled his horse. Clara watched him, Eli on her hip. "Where are you going?" she asked, worry flickering across her face. "Town," he said. "See if there's news." She swallowed hard, then nodded. The ride into Willow Creek felt different this time. The streets were livelier, wagons moving, shops reopening. People nodded at him, some curious about the stranger who had lingered near town all winter. At the general store, he asked about Samuel Mayfield. The shopkeeper frowned. "Mayfield? Yeah, I heard of him. Poor bastard didn't make it. Found frozen near the pass, couple months back." John stood there, the words like ice in his chest. He nodded once, thanked the man, and walked out. On the ride back, the world felt sharper, the air cutting. He thought of Clara's eyes, always searching the horizon. He thought of what it would mean to tell her, to crush the last thread of hope she carried. When he reached the camp, Clara came forward quickly, searching his face. "Did you find anything?" she asked. John looked at her, at Eli's bright eyes, at the fragile hope trembling in her. He wanted to lie, to tell her nothing was known, to let her hold on to her dream a little longer. But lies had a way of turning to poison. He dismounted slowly. "Clara," he said, his voice rough. "He's gone. They found him near the pass." The words broke her like a sudden storm. She sank to her knees, clutching Eli, sobs racking her body. John stood there, helpless, the weight of her grief pressing down like the sky itself. He knelt beside her, his hand hovering, then finally resting on her shoulder. He stayed there, silent, until the sobs quieted, until she leaned against him, her tears soaking his coat. In that moment, he knew something had changed forever. They were no longer bound by pity, nor by chance. They were bound by loss, by survival, by something deeper than either had asked for. And though the road ahead was uncertain, John Calhoun understood that he was no longer a lonely cowboy passing through. He had found something he had not sought, a reason to stay, and a reason to fight for more than himself. Clara did not speak much the next few days. She moved through camp like a shadow, her eyes hollow, her hands steady only when tending to Eli. Grief was a storm John had seen before. It ripped through the strongest hearts and left them bare. He did not try to force words into her silence. Instead, he cut more wood, hunted longer, kept the fire going when the nights dipped cold again. He stayed close enough so she would not feel abandoned, far enough so she could weep without shame. One evening, as the last of the snow melted from the pines, she sat beside the fire with Eli asleep against her. Her gaze was distant, but her voice was clear. "He tried so hard. Samuel believed the land could be tamed. He believed we could build something here." Her fingers traced the baby's cheek. "Now it's just me." John stirred the coals with a stick, sparks snapping upward. "Not just you," he said quietly. Her eyes shifted to him, searching, uncertain. He did not say more, but his words lingered in the space between them, a promise without shape. As spring settled, the camp changed. Green shoots broke through the thawing earth. Rivers swelled, and with them came fish that John caught with lines he fashioned from rawhide. Clara learned to stretch rabbit stew with wild onions, to mend his shirts with thread she salvaged from her own dress. Life was still hard, but not desperate. Eli grew stronger, his laughter brightening the camp, a sound that made John's chest ache in a way he could not name. One afternoon, Clara insisted on walking with him to gather wood. She wore Samuel's old coat, the sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back against the wind. Eli rested in a sling at her chest, gurgling softly. John watched her move through the forest, the grief still in her eyes but tempered now by a resolve. "You'll need more than hunting and chopping," she said, kneeling to stack branches. "If you mean to stay through summer, you'll need a garden. Potatoes, beans, squash, things that keep." John raised a brow. "You planning on planting one?" She met his gaze steadily. "If we're going to live, we have to start thinking past tomorrow." The word, "we," hung in the air. John felt it sink into him, heavier than iron. He nodded once. "Then we'll plant." The work began the next day. Together they cleared a patch of ground near the camp, breaking earth with a shovel John had carried for years but rarely used. Clara's hands were raw from digging, but she did not stop. Eli watched from a blanket spread in the grass, kicking and babbling, his laughter drifting on the wind. By midsummer, the garden grew green and thick, and the camp no longer felt like a place of passing. It felt like something being built. Clara's cheeks filled out, her eyes brighter. John felt the change in himself too. He found reasons to speak, to share small stories from the trail, even to laugh once in a while. He caught himself watching her when she wasn't looking, the way her hair fell loose at night, the way she hummed softly to Eli, the way her strength seemed carved out of grief but softened by hope. Yet beneath the warmth, he carried a fear. The world had a way of taking back what it gave, and he knew better than most that peace was a fragile thing. One morning, riders appeared. Dust rose behind them, their voices carrying on the wind. John's hand went to his rifle as three men approached the camp. Their horses were lean, their clothes travel-worn, eyes sharp with hunger. The leader, a broad man with a scar across his cheek, eyed Clara and the baby before turning to John. "Nice setup you got here," he said. "Garden, firewood, meat hanging to dry. Must have been a good winter." John's grip tightened on the rifle. "It was hard enough." The man grinned, showing yellow teeth. "Hard for some. We're short on supplies. Thought you might share." Clara drew Eli closer, her face pale. John stepped forward, his voice flat. "Ain't nothing free here." The man's grin faded. He leaned in his saddle, his eyes narrowed. "Careful, cowboy. We're three and you're one." John's heart beat steady. He had faced men like this before, men who fed off weakness, who thought numbers made them strong. He lifted the rifle just enough, his eyes locked on the leaders. "And you're alive now. Best keep it that way." The standoff stretched, silence broken only by the horses shifting. They rode off, but the air remained tense long after. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched Eli. John lowered the rifle slowly, the weight of what might have been pressing heavy on him. That night, as the fire burned low, Clara looked at him across the flames. "They'll be back, maybe," John said. She hesitated, then whispered, "What if you hadn't been here?" John met her gaze, his voice steady. "Then you wouldn't have stood a chance." Her eyes filled, but not with tears. It was something else, something deeper, a recognition. She nodded, then looked down at Eli, stroking his hair. From that day on, John taught her to shoot. She was clumsy at first, flinching at the crack of the rifle, but her hands steadied with each lesson. He showed her how to hold the weapon, how to breathe, how to wait before pulling the trigger. By summer's end, she could strike a tin can at 30 yards. "For Eli," she said each time, her eyes fierce. John felt pride swell in him, not only for her skill but for her will to survive. She was no longer the woman begging for bread on a frozen porch. She was stronger now, forged by hardship, and he found himself drawn to her more with every passing day. But the closer they grew, the heavier the question loomed. What were they to each other? She was a widow with a child. He was a drifter who had never stayed anywhere long. Yet their lives had twined together, thread by thread, until it was hard to see where one ended and the other began. One night, after Eli had fallen asleep, Clara sat by the fire, her face lit by the glow. She looked at John, her voice trembling but steady. "Do you ever think of leaving?" He stared into the flames for a long time. "Used to. It's what I've always done." And now, he lifted his eyes to hers. The silence stretched, heavy with meaning. Now I don't. Her breath caught, her lips parting as though to speak, but she said nothing. Instead, she reached across the fire and took his hand. Her touch was warm, her grip strong. John held it, and in that simple act, something passed between them, something unspoken but undeniable. The weeks that followed deepened their bond. They worked side by side, raising the garden, hunting, caring for Eli. They shared stories of the past. Clara of her childhood in Missouri, John of the cattle drives and the long roads that had carried him far from home. At night, they sat close by the fire, their hands brushing, their shoulders leaning together. One evening, a storm swept through, rain pounding the earth, wind tearing at the tent. Clara woke to Eli's cries, and John was there instantly, steadying the canvas, soothing the child, holding them both close as thunder shook the sky. When the storm passed, they sat together in the dark, drenched and trembling, but alive. Clara leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, a quiet certainty settling over him. As autumn came, the garden yielded its harvest, potatoes, beans, squash enough to last the winter. They stacked wood high, smoked meat, stored grain. For the first time, John looked at the coming snow not with dread but with readiness. He was no longer preparing only for himself. He was preparing for a family. Yet the world did not forget them. The riders returned one gray morning, more of them this time, 5 men, rough and hungry. They circled the camp, their eyes sharp with intent. The scarred leader grinned at John. "Told you we'd be back." John stood firm, rifle in hand, Clara at his side with Eli hidden behind her. His voice was cold. "Then you'd best be ready to leave the way you came." The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. He raised his hand, and the others moved to dismount. Before they could, a shot cracked. Clara's rifle smoked, the tin can target she'd set for practice weeks ago replaced now by the man's hat, knocked clean off his head. The leader froze, eyes wide. Clara's voice rang out, steady and fierce. "The next shot won't miss." The silence was sharp, every breath held. Then the man snarled, yanked his reins, and turned his horse. "Let's go," he spat. They rode off, dust rising behind them, their thread unfulfilled, for now. John looked at Clara, pride and something deeper burning in his chest. She lowered the rifle, her hands shaking only after the danger had passed. He stepped to her, his hand on her shoulder, his voice low. "You saved us." Her eyes met his, fierce and tender all at once. "We saved each other." And in that moment, with the world vast and dangerous around them, John Calhoun knew he was no longer alone. The lonely cowboy who had ridden into town for supplies had found something far greater, a bond forged in hunger, in fire, in survival, and in love that neither had sought but both had needed. The scarred men were gone, swallowed into the horizon, but their shadows lingered. John knew men like that didn't give up easy. They'd circle back when the hunger grew sharper, when desperation hardened into cruelty. Clara knew it too. He could see it in the way her shoulders stayed tight, in the way she kept Eli closer than before, her hand never far from the rifle. The next days passed under a veil of unease. The camp was quiet, almost too quiet, the sounds of the forest muffled by the weight of what had nearly been. John rose before dawn each morning, patrolling the edges of their clearing, his boots silent in the grass, his eyes scanning for tracks. He found some once, hoof prints pressed deep into the mud not far from the river. They hadn't been there the day before. He didn't tell Clara, not then. She already carried enough weight. Instead, he doubled the work. He built a higher stack of wood, reinforced the tent, dug a trench around the garden so water would flow right and roots wouldn't rot when autumn rains came. Clara worked beside him, never complaining, her face set with quiet determination. Eli grew stronger, crawling now, his laughter carrying through the trees, a sound that cut through even John's darkest thoughts. At night, when Eli finally slept, John and Clara sat together by the fire, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing fragments of their past. The silence no longer felt empty. One evening, as dusk bled into night, Clara broke it. "You could have left after the storm," she said softly. "After Samuel, after all of it. But you stayed." John kept his eyes on the flames. "I couldn't ride on." "Why not?" He hesitated, the words heavy. Finally, he spoke. Because when I saw you and the boy, I remembered what it felt like. To need someone. To not be alone. She looked at him, her eyes bright in the firelight. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Eli stirred, breaking the moment, and Clara turned back to soothe him. John sat still, but the truth of his words hung in the air between them, undeniable. The seasons turned, and autumn painted the world in fire and gold. The garden yielded more than they expected. Clara filled jars with beans and squash, stacked potatoes in burlap sacks, dried herbs on lines that fluttered in the cool wind. John smoked venison and salted what he could, the sharp smell filling the camp. Together, they built something that looked less like a camp and more like a home. But John's unease never left. He could feel the eyes of the riders even when they weren't there, like wolves circling the edges of firelight. He started carving stakes to set in the ground, shaping snares from rawhide, laying traps where a man on horseback wouldn't see until too late. Clara noticed. Of course. They'll come back, she said one morning, her voice flat. They will, John replied. And when they do. John looked at her, at Eli crawling through the grass near her feet, his small hands grasping leaves with wonder. Then we make sure they don't again. The first frost came early. It glittered across the grass, turning the world silver in the morning light. John woke with his breath visible inside the tent, his bones aching with the memory of winters past. He stepped outside to split wood, the axe biting sharp, his thoughts steady. He didn't hear the riders until the horses were already too close. The scarred man was back, 5 with him this time, their faces harder, their eyes hungry. They came at dawn, guns visible, the smell of whiskey on their breath even through the cold air. Clara was at the fire, Eli in her lap. She froze when she saw them, her hands clutching the boy. John set the axe down slowly, his rifle leaning against the tent just steps away. Too far. The scarred man grinned, but there was no humor in it. Told you we'd be back. You had your chance to share. Now we're taking. John said nothing, only shifted slightly, his weight balanced, his eyes steady. He could feel Clara's fear behind him like heat. Eli whimpered, and the sound twisted inside him. The man lifted his pistol. Step aside, cowboy. Don't make it hard. Time slow. John's eyes flicked once to Clara. She had shifted Eli behind her and her hand was already on the rifle. When the shot came, it wasn't the scarred man's, it was Clara's. The crack split the air, and one of the riders fell from his saddle, blood dark against the frost. The others shouted, chaos erupting. John dove for his rifle, rolling as bullets tore into the ground where he'd stood. He fired once, twice, another man dropping, his horse screaming and bolting into the trees. Clara pulled Eli into the tent, shielding him, then came back out, her face pale but her hands steady. The scarred man roared, charging forward. John fired, grazing his arm, but the man didn't fall. He leapt from the saddle, slamming into John, the two crashing into the dirt. The rifle flew from John's hands. Fists, mud, blood, the world narrowed to the man's breath in his face, the stink of whiskey and hate. The scarred man's knife flashed, but John caught his wrist, their struggle vicious, desperate. Clara's voice cut through. John. The man twisted, his blade pressing close, but in that heartbeat of distraction John drove his knee up, twisting the knife from his grip. With a final, brutal shove, he slammed the man into the ground, the knife now in John's hand. The man froze, breath ragged, eyes wide. John's chest heaved. He could end it. He wanted to. But behind him, Eli cried, and Clara's voice whispered, trembling but steady, don't. John's hand shook. Then he dropped the knife into the dirt. Get out, he growled. The scarred man scrambled up, clutching his bleeding arm, rage burning in his eyes. This ain't over, he spat, before stumbling to his horse. The survivors followed, broken, beaten, disappearing into the trees. The clearing was silent except for Eli's cries. Clara ran to him, clutching him to her chest, her tears falling hot against his hair. John stood, covered in mud and blood, his hands trembling. He looked at Clara, at Eli, at the life they had fought to hold. That night, the fire burned low. Clara sat close to him, her hand brushing his. You could have killed him, she whispered. I wanted to, John admitted. His voice was rough, raw. But you didn't. He looked at her then, their eyes meeting, and for the first time he let her see the weight he carried, the violence, the loneliness, the scars the world had carved into him. And she didn't look away. She reached for his hand, held it, and in that touch, something shifted. The days that followed were quieter. No more riders came. Perhaps the scarred man had learned, or perhaps he waited. John didn't care. He had made his choice. To stay, to fight for this life, for this woman and child. He found himself building more than he ever had before. He cut logs, raising walls for a cabin, small but sturdy. Clara helped. Her hands blistered, her laughter returning in bursts when Eli toddled around the site, his first steps clumsy but determined. When the cabin stood, rough-hewn and smelling of pine, Clara placed Eli's blanket on the floor and stood in the doorway, her eyes shining. "It feels like a home," she whispered. John looked at her, the firelight warming her face, Eli's small hand clutching her skirt. His chest ached, but it wasn't the ache of loneliness anymore. It was something heavier, something deeper. He had found what he didn't know he was searching for. And though the winter would come again, though danger might rise from the horizon, John Calhoun knew he would no longer ride alone. The cabin walls held the heat better than canvas ever could. When the first snow of the new winter came, soft and steady, it muffled the world outside, but inside the small room the fire crackled warm, casting light against pine boards still rough to the touch. Clara sat by the hearth, mending a shirt with careful stitches, Eli asleep in a cradle John had carved from a split log and lined with rabbit pelts. John sat sharpening his knife, his hand steady, his mind restless. He had never known quiet like this. Nights on the trail had always been restless with coyotes, wind, and men who never trusted each other enough to sleep deep. Now there was only Clara's soft humming, Eli's breathing, the pop of firewood. It should have felt like peace. And it did, some nights. But other nights, he found himself staring into the flames, listening for hoofbeats he knew could return at any hour. One evening, Clara spoke without looking up from her sewing. "You think they'll come back?" John didn't answer right away. The whetstone rasped against the blade, his jaw tight. "Men like that don't forget," he said finally. Her needle paused, then moved again. "And if they do?" He looked at her, at the firelight on her face, the strength in her hands. "Then we need 'em same as before. Only this time, we're ready." Her eyes lifted to his, steady, unwavering. "We," she repeated. The word struck him deep. For years he had lived as one man alone, bound to no one, expected by no one. Now, with one word, Clara had tied his fate to hers, and to Eli's. The thought no longer frightened him. It steadied him. Through the short days and long nights, they built more. John split planks to fashion a table, rough but sturdy. Clara baked bread in a small stone oven she shaped from river rock. They traded with townsfolk when they dared ride in, exchanging dried meat and pelts for sugar, salt, and cloth. People looked at them differently now, not as strangers passing through but as settlers, a family carving something of their own out of the wilderness. Still, shadows lingered. The scarred man haunted John's thoughts. Sometimes he dreamt of him, his knife flashing, his breath hot with whiskey. Sometimes he woke to the creak of the cabin, hand already on his rifle. Clara would stir then, her hand brushing his arm, grounding him. "You're here," she whispered once, and it was enough to calm the storm inside him. Winter pressed harder. Snow piled against the cabin walls, the wind howling through the pines. Eli grew sick one night, his forehead hot, his cries thin and weak. Clara held him close, rocking him, tears slipping down her face. John worked feverishly, brewing willow bark for fever, wrapping the boy in warm pelts, heating stones to press near his small body. For 3 nights they barely slept, fear gnawing at them, every shallow breath from Eli like a knife in John's chest. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. The boy slept deep and steady, his small chest rising and falling with ease. Clara wept into John's shoulder, her body trembling with both relief and exhaustion. John held her, his rough hands gentler than he'd ever known they could be. It was then, in that moment of weakness and relief, that Clara lifted her face to his. Her lips brushed his, soft and trembling, but real. John froze, the world narrowing to her breath, her touch. Then he kissed her back, slow and certain, the firelight flickering against their joined shadows. It was not a promise spoken aloud, but it was a promise all the same. After that night, something shifted. They did not speak of it, but their closeness deepened. John found himself reaching for her hand when she passed him bread, brushing her shoulder when they worked side by side, lingering near her in the quiet moments when Eli slept. Clara no longer looked to the horizon with grief in her eyes. She looked to John. As spring thawed the world again, life grew easier. The garden flourished, the river swelled with fish, and Eli learned to walk, his laughter filling the clearing as he stumbled through grass taller than his knees. Clara's cheeks grew sun-kissed, her laughter lighter, her voice carrying songs she hadn't sung in years. John, who had lived half his life in silence, found himself smiling more, even laughing at Eli's clumsy antics. But peace was a fragile thing. One afternoon, as John checked his traps deeper in the woods, he found a fire still smoking, the ground trampled with fresh hoofprints. More than one horse, more than one man. He crouched, pressing his hand to the soil. Still warm. They were close. His jaw tightened. When he returned to the cabin, Clara saw the look in his eyes. "Them?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Not far. Watching." She pulled Eli close, her lips tightening. "What do we do?" "We get ready." That night, they worked side by side, stacking wood in tighter piles near the door for barricade, filling buckets with water from the creek, laying rifles within easy reach. John dug shallow trenches at the edge of the clearing, traps set for horses. Clara checked each bullet, her hands steady though her face was pale. Eli slept through it all, his innocence a reminder of what they were fighting for. The attack came 2 nights later. It was moonless, the forest dark, the only sound the wind in the pines. John heard the horses first, low and steady. He woke Clara with a hand on her shoulder, his rifle already in hand. She gathered Eli, pressing him into the cradle hidden behind the stacked wood. Then she took her place at the window slit John had carved into the wall. Shadows moved through the trees, figures spreading out, rifles glinting faint in the starlight. John's heart hammered, but his breath was steady. He raised the rifle, waiting. When the first man stepped into the clearing, John fired. The man fell, his shout breaking the silence. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked, bullets slamming into the cabin walls, splinters flying. Clara fired from her slit, her shot true, another rider falling back. Eli cried, the sound cutting through the thunder of guns, but Clara didn't waver, her jaw tight. The scarred man's voice rang out in the dark. "Burn it! Burn 'em out!" Flames flared as torches flew, landing near the garden, the dry grass catching quick. John cursed, firing again, dropping another. But the flames licked closer. Smoke thickened. Clara coughed, clutching Eli close as she reloaded. John knew they couldn't hold forever. He turned to her, his voice sharp but steady. "We run for the creek. Now." She shook her head, fear wild in her eyes. "They'll cut us down. All cover. Go." For a moment, it seemed she might refuse. Then Eli cried again, and her resolve hardened. She wrapped him tight in blankets, slung him across her chest, and nodded. John kicked the door open, firing into the dark, his shots fast and deliberate. Clara ran, darting low. Eli clutched tight, her feet pounding the frozen ground. The riders shouted, guns cracking, but John's fire was relentless, forcing them to duck, to scatter. Clara reached the tree line, breath ragged, and John followed, his rifle hot in his hands. They ran through the woods, the smoke behind them, the riders, curses echoing. Branches tore at their clothes, roots caught their feet, but they didn't stop until the sound of the creek roared ahead. They plunged into the icy water, the current biting, pulling. Clara gasped, nearly losing her footing, but John grabbed her, steadying her as they waded. Across. Behind them, the riders shouted, searching, but the current swept their tracks away. They reached the far bank, soaked, shivering, but alive. They collapsed beneath the trees, breathless, Eli wailing but safe in Clara's arms. The glow of the burning cabin lit the sky behind them, smoke curling into the night. Clara stared, tears streaking her face. Everything we built. John's chest heaved, his jaw tight. He looked at her, at Eli, at the fire that consumed their home. We'll build again, he said, his voice fierce. As long as we're alive, we can build again. Clara turned to him, her eyes shining with grief and fire both. She clutched Eli close, then leaned against John, her strength meeting his. In that moment, with the world burning behind them, they knew the truth. They were no longer just surviving. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves. And they would not stop. The creek water froze their bones. By the time they crawled up the far bank, their clothes clung heavy and stiff, their breath ragged in the night. Clara clutched Eli close, his small body trembling but alive. John's hands shook, not from fear but from cold and fury. Behind them, smoke rose higher, the cabin burning down to embers, the only home they had built together lost in a single night. Clara sat in the wet leaves, rocking Eli as he whimpered. Her hair clung damp to her face, her cheeks pale but her eyes steady. She looked at John through the shadows. What now? She whispered. John knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder, the other resting on his rifle. His jaw was tight, his voice steady. We don't run. Not anymore. We finish this. For a moment, Clara only stared at him, the weight of his words sinking deep. Then she nodded once, fierce and sure. Found shelter in a shallow cave along the ridge, dry enough for a fire, hidden enough that riders would pass without noticing. John hunted, his movements sharp with purpose, while Clara kept Eli warm, wrapping him in every scrap of fur they had left. The child clung to her, his laughter quieter now but still present, a fragile light in the darkness. John used the time to think, to plan. The scarred man had proved what John already knew: there would be no peace until it was settled. They had taken his quiet, his cabin, tried to take Clara and Eli. If he let them live, they'd circle back again and again. Wolves didn't stop until the pack was broken. On the fourth day, John saddled his horse. Clara stood by, Eli on her hip, her lips pressed tight. You're going after them. I have to. Her eyes filled, but she didn't beg him to stay. She knew as well as he did. Still, her hand reached for his arm, holding tight. Don't let the dark take you, John. Don't let them make you something you're not. He looked at her then, at Eli's small face pressed against her shoulder, and something fierce rose inside him. I won't, he said. I've got something worth coming back to. Before dawn, he rode. The horse's hooves cut through frost and dirt, carrying him across ridges and through forests until he found the trail. He followed the tracks, broken branches, smoldering fire pits, the stink of whiskey left behind. He tracked them for 2 days, sleeping little, his rifle always close. At night, he thought of Clara and Eli in the cave, the firelight on her face, her voice steady in his memory. That thought kept him sharp, kept him alive. On the third morning, he found them. The riders had camped in a hollow near the river, 6 men in all, their horses tethered, their laughter carrying in the cold air. The scarred man sat by the fire, his arm bandaged, his face twisted in anger even when he grinned. John watched from the trees, his breath steady, his eyes narrowing. He could wait until night, strike from the shadows, cut them down one by one. But that wasn't enough. It had to end. All of it. He stepped out of the trees, rifle in hand, his boots loud on the frozen ground. The laughter died. 6 heads turned. The scarred man stood slowly, his grin spreading wide. Well, the cowboy finally grew a spine. John raised the rifle, his voice flat. This ends here. The scarred man laughed, drawing his pistol. You think 1 man can take 6? John fired. The shot cracked the air, the nearest rider falling before his gun cleared leather. Chaos erupted. Men shouting, scrambling for weapons. John moved like a storm, firing, reloading, firing again. 2 more fell, their screams cut short. A bullet grazed his shoulder, fire lancing through him, but he didn't stop. He dropped another, the man's body hitting the dirt hard. 4 down, 2 left. The scarred man charged, his knife flashing. John swung the rifle, the stock cracking against the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. The last rider raised his gun, but John was faster, the shot echoing as the man crumpled. Only the scarred man remained, blood on his mouth, fury in his eyes. He staggered up, knife clutched tight. You should have run, cowboy. You and that widow. We'd have found you anyway. John's blood boiled. He dropped the rifle, his fists ready. The 2 men clashed, raw and brutal, fists and knives and rage. The scarred man's blade slashed John's side, hot pain searing, but John didn't falter. He drove his fist into the man's jaw, his knee into his gut, until the knife clattered to the dirt. John grabbed it, pressing the blade to the man's throat. His breath heaved, his vision red. One push and it would be done. The man had earned it. Deserved it. Then Clara's voice echoed in his memory. "Don't let the dark take you." John froze. His grip trembled. Slowly, he lowered the knife, his voice rough. "You're done. Leave, and never come back." The scarred man spat blood, hatred burning in his eyes. But he saw the truth there too. The fire in John's gaze, the strength of a man who no longer stood alone. He stumbled back, clutching his jaw, then turned and fled into the trees. The hollow fell silent, bodies scattered, smoke rising from the dead fire. John stood there, blood on his hands, pain in his side, but his soul unbroken. He had chosen. He would not be like them. The ride back to the cave was long. His wound bled, each mile harder than the last, but he pressed on, the thought of Clara pulling him forward. When at last he reached the ridge, the cave came into view, smoke curling gently from its mouth. Clara was there, Eli in her arms, her eyes searching the horizon. When she saw him, her face broke, fear, relief, love all at once. She ran to him, her hands on his face, her tears warm against his skin. "You came back," she whispered. "Always," he said, his voice ragged but true. She helped him inside, cleaned his wound, her touch gentle but strong. Eli toddled to him, his small hands gripping John's sleeve, his laughter breaking through the heaviness. John held the boy close, his heart full in a way he hadn't known was possible. Spring came again, and with it, new beginnings. They built another cabin, stronger this time, walls thick, roof high. The garden grew once more, the river gave fish, and the forest gave game. Life returned, piece by piece. But something had changed. They were no longer simply surviving. They were living, together. On a summer evening, with the sky painted gold, Clara stood beside him on the porch of their new cabin. Eli played in the grass, his laughter carrying. She slipped her hand into John's, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. "We've lost so much," she said, softly. John looked at her, his gaze steady. "And we've found more." Her eyes met his, shining with tears, with love. "Do you think it'll last? This peace?" He tightened his grip on her hand, his voice firm. "As long as we fight for it. As long as we stay together." And in that moment, John Calhoun, the lonely cowboy who had once ridden into town with nothing but hunger and silence, knew he had found what he had never dared hope for. Not just shelter, not just survival, but a home, a family, a reason to stay. The plains stretched endless beyond them, wild and dangerous, but no longer empty. For in the firelight of that cabin, in the laughter of a child and the love in a woman's eyes, John had discovered something stronger than the darkness. Something that would endure. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.